This press conference is being held by Justice Richard Goldstone, and I'd like to welcome Justice Goldstone to the United Nations in New York. Justice Goldstone is briefing us in his capacity as head of the United Nations fact-finding mission on the Gaza conflict. And as you know, the mandate of the fact-finding mission was to investigate all violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law that may have been committed at any time in the context of the military operations that were conducted in Gaza during the period from 27 December 2008 and 18 January 2009, whether before, during, or after.
Well, Mr. Fawzi, thank you very much for your extremely warm invitation. I would like to thank all of you for coming at very short notice and to make an apology for the last minute notice and also for the unavailability ahead of time of the full report. I can give you my word that this report was completed literally within the last few hours. It's been a mammoth effort, and our staff have been working mainly in Geneva but also in New York day and night to get it out today. And obviously it had to come out well enough ahead of the formal presentation of the report before the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which will happen on the 29th of this month. The parties, I might say, the government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority in particular, and the authorities in Gaza, only received this report in the last 30 or so minutes. It's because you haven't had an opportunity of reading the report, even the not short executive summary, that I would like to give you some of the main aspects, and only some of them that appear in the report, to put you in a position, I hope, to ask informed questions at the end of it. I won't be too long. But I would like to indicate some of the findings and recommendations contained in the report, and I emphasize that, having regard to its length, I do no more than skim the surface. Mr. Fawzi has given you the mandate of the mission, and it appears too on the press release. For practical reasons, the mission decided for the most part to restrict its time period between with the start date of the 16th of June of 2008. That was a neutral date on which the ceasefire between Israel and the and Hamas and the armed groups came into operation, and we take it through to the 31st of July of this year. We obviously had to have a cut-off date, and the end of July was it. Let me immediately say that the report reflects the unanimous view of the 4 members of the mission. It's been a great pleasure and privilege for me to have worked with the other 3 members, whose names also appear from the press release. We've come from very different corners of the world, from Pakistan, from the United Kingdom, and Ireland and South Africa, but we have had in common a long period, decades-long period of involvement both in international law, international humanitarian law, and in particular human rights. The mission only began its work in May of this year, and it really has been a very intensive period. I can't remember any period in my life where there's been where I've really devoted so much time, day and night, to a particular mission. The mission conducted 188 individual interviews. We reviewed over 10,000 pages of documentation. We viewed some 1,200 photographs, including satellite imagery and videotapes. We heard 38 testimonies from people at public hearings, which were webcast and which were held over 4 days, 2 in Gaza and 2 in Geneva. I would also like to emphasize that as far as the law is concerned, the mission was guided solely by the norms of relevant international law. That was the law, obviously, that we were guided by in everything that we did. We attempted to the best of our ability to come to factual conclusions only on the facts that we found to have been established during our mission. We have obviously not held judicial or even quasi-judicial proceedings. This is a fact-finding mission which is at a very different level from any judicial investigation. The facts we've found proven on which we've made findings and recommendations have certainly not been established to any criminal standard, whether in the common law, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, or the equivalent in the civil law systems. In making findings of fact, we relied primarily on our own evaluation of the people who spoke to us and from what we saw in Gaza with our own eyes. You will see each chapter of the report begins with what we found from our own investigations, and we try to use hearsay reports from non-governmental organizations, from government sources. We use those to the greatest extent for corroboration and not as first-hand information. The exception to that related to some aspects of events on the West Bank and in Israel, because we weren't allowed there. It was very disappointing that the government of Israel would not allow us into Israel at all. So it wasn't only a question of non-cooperation from government sources, but also we were prohibited from speaking to people on the ground, and by the same token, we were not allowed to visit the West Bank. We had to meet Israeli witnesses in Geneva, in Amman, and so too witnesses from the West Bank. We came to the conclusion on the basis of the facts we found that there was strong evidence to establish that numerous serious violations of international law, both humanitarian law and human rights law, were committed by Israel during the military operations in Gaza. The mission concluded that actions amounting to war crimes, and possibly in some respects crimes against humanity, were committed by the Israel Defense Force. The incidents that were investigated in Gaza that related to the military operations were not such that the mission has in any way attempted to second-guess decisions that were taken by the Israel Defense Force in the heat of battle. And I want to emphasize this. If you read the report, you will see the 36 incidents that we investigated, by and large, and to the greatest extent possible, do not relate to, as I say, second-guessing commanders or soldiers who were in the heat of battle. What we're talking about is a much broader aspect of the deliberate policies that were adopted and the military actions that were taken, not in urgency, not in urgent situations. We chose to investigate incidents rather that appeared to the mission to be either reckless, disproportionate, or deliberate. Turning to the Palestinian armed groups, there is no question that the firing of rockets and mortars was deliberate and calculated to cause loss of life and injury to civilians and damage to civilian structures. The mission found that these actions also amount to serious war crimes and also possibly crimes against humanity. In Chapter 11 of the report, you will see, for example, that we detail a number of specific incidents in which Israeli forces launched direct attacks against civilians with lethal consequences. With only one exception referred to there, the facts establish that there was no military objective that we could find, no military advantage that we could find, and we looked, that could justify those attacks. Let me give you one example. And I choose it really, I could have chosen any of the 36, but let me choose one. And that relates to a mortar attack on the Al-Muqaddamah Mosque in Gaza City. During the military operations, it was explained to us by the Imam and other religious leaders that in Gaza, in order to avoid civilians having to be in the streets more than necessary during the war, which was obviously dangerous, the morning and evening services were combined and held in the late afternoon. And during one of those late afternoon services, the Al-Muqaddamah Mosque, which is a fairly new mosque, some 3 years old, we visited it and spent some time speaking to some of the victims and to the leaders of the congregation. We found, and the evidence is really not controvertible, that there were several hundred people gathered in the mosque for the late afternoon service. And during the service, the mosque was mortared. The mortar shell, and a powerful one, came literally through the front door, killed 15 members of the congregation who were in the middle of worshipping at the service, and injured many others. The reasons that at times have been given by the Israeli government and the Israel Defense Force for targeting mosques was twofold. One, that mosques were used to as a sanctuary by members of military armed groups in Gaza, and secondly, that weapons were at times stored at mosques. We questioned witnesses at length. We came to the conclusion that there was no question of militants having looked for sanctuary during the service, or indeed at any other time in that mosque. What happened in other mosques we didn't investigate, and we specifically say we do not comment. But in any event, assuming that there were militants in a congregation of hundreds gathered at that time, on the assumption, and it doesn't appear to be a correct assumption, on the assumption that there were weapons stored at the mosque, there is no justification in international humanitarian law, or from any moral point of view, to mortar the mosque during the service with hundreds of civilians there. If there were weapons there and the mosque was a justifiable target, it could have been attacked in the wee hours of the night, or certainly at a time when it wasn't being used for a service with civilians present. And I might say there was no evidence of any secondary explosions that one would expect if there were weapons being stored there. So it's that sort of event that you will find examined in the chapter to which I've referred. Incidentally, I would add that from all the documentation we received from the Israeli government, and it wasn't addressed to us, as I think you're aware, the Israeli government refused all cooperation, but they did issue a fairly lengthy document during the course of our mission, which came to us from a third-party source, I might add. There was no suggestion that the incident to which I've referred took place in error. The careful planning of the military operations and the precision armaments used by the Israel Defense Force are inconsistent with error. You will find the details of the other 35 incidents in the report. Some of them relate to the use by the Israeli military of human shields in violation, I might add, of an earlier ruling by the Israel Supreme Court, sitting as a High Court of Justice in Jerusalem, which in unequivocal terms held that the sort of use of human shields was unlawful, and an order was made against the Israel Defense Force to cease that practice. The mission investigated in some deal the effects on the civilian population in southern Israel of the sustained rocket and mortar attacks from Palestinian armed groups. And you'll find a chapter of the report where the detail of our investigation are set out. We detail the suffering of victims and the highly prejudicial effects of these acts on the towns and cities that fall within the range of the rockets and mortars. We talked about the effect on school children, the fear and terror of people who at very short notice got air raid warnings of much less than a minute in many cases of impending rocket attacks, and it really was a matter of luck that the death toll was not a great deal higher than it was. it was kept low to a great extent by the precautions that were taken by the Israeli government in providing shelters to protect people and the warning system. I might mention in that context that we are critical of the Israeli government for apparently not affording Israeli Palestinian citizens similar protection that was given to Jewish residents affected by rocket and mortar attacks. There were formal and informal settlements of Israeli Palestinians, Israeli citizens who did not receive the same protections as Jewish Israelis. The mission decided that it was necessary to understand the effects of the Israeli military operations on the infrastructure and economy of Gaza, and especially its food supplies. And I might add, in the long report that came from the Israeli government, this is one aspect that is not mentioned at all. We decided that in order to understand it, we had to look at the effects of the long blockade of the Gaza Strip by Israel over some years. And there's a chapter in our report where we explain and describe what its effect was, and how since Hamas won the elections a couple of years ago, that blockade has been tightened. For example, the mission investigated and visited the flour factory that was destroyed by an Israeli bombing attack. The flour factory was the only one still operating in Gaza. A large part of the Gaza egg production was destroyed. Tens of thousands tens of thousands of chickens were destroyed by Israeli fire, and that completely destroyed, as I say, a large part of the egg production. Some hundreds of factories, many of them food factories, were bombed. Many agricultural fields were bulldozed and destroyed. Now, we came to the conclusion that that sort of destruction cannot be justified by international law, and particularly international humanitarian law at all. It really had nothing to do with the purpose which Israel gave for the military operations, namely to stop the firing of rockets and mortars. Details of these attacks on those factories and on the fields can be seen from a 34-page report annexed to the main report. It's a report from UNISAT, the United Nations Satellite Facility, that gave us satellite imagery detailing on the relevant dates what happened, and those satellite imagery is also available. The mission looked closely and sets out in the report statements made by Israeli political and military leaders in which they stated in clear terms they would hit at the, quote, Hamas infrastructure, unquote. In the view of the mission, this might have well been a political policy aimed at destroying support for Hamas amongst the population of Gaza, but in the view of the mission, that was not a justification for military operations for that purpose under international law. If infrastructure is understood to include civilian targets, civilians themselves or civilian objects, that would completely subvert the whole purpose of international humanitarian law that was built up over the last 100 years and more. It would make civilians and civilian buildings justifiable targets because there was some political, not military advantage to be gained. The mission came to the conclusion that those attacks, which had no military justification, amounted to collective punishment and or reprisals and constituted war crimes. The mission has also considered, in chapters you will find in the report, the many human rights violations that have been perpetrated in Israel, on the West Bank, and in Gaza. We dealt there in particular with the intra-Palestinian problems, assassinations, torture, detentions that have taken place both in the Gaza Strip by Hamas against Fatah supporters and on the West Bank the other way around. Let me come to a conclusion by referring to just a few of the recommendations. You will find at the end of the report a list of legal conclusions and recommendations. The mission debated long and hard what appropriate accountability would be in the situation that we found. And the one possibility obviously was to make a recommendation to the Security Council that it should consider referring the situation, both the firing of rockets and mortars and the war crimes we found committed by the Israel Defense Force, to the International Criminal Court. We were critical of what we regarded really, it's my word, not in the report. I would suggest that the efforts by Israel to investigate the alleged violations of international law have been pusillanimous. And on the other side, there has been a complete absence of investigation by the Gaza authorities in an event to deter or stop the unlawful attacks by rockets and mortars fired into southern Israel. We came to the conclusion that we should give full recognition to what is now the position in international criminal law, that of complementarity. It's been recognized by the international community in the Rome Statute and by the 110 members of the United Nations that have ratified the Rome Statute that the first choice is domestic investigations. It's only where domestic investigations are not possible that the International Criminal Court is permitted to accept jurisdiction and investigate. And while we're critical of both Israel and the Gaza authorities for having done far too little in that regard, we came to the conclusion that these are cases where there may be unwillingness, but there is ability. Clearly Israel is able to launch and to hold open, transparent investigations and launch prosecutions that are consistent with international legal requirements. And we came to the conclusion that the Gaza authorities, there are courts operating, there are judges and lawyers in Gaza, and if there's the will, there is the ability to have domestic investigations. And we came to the conclusion that we should recommend to the Security Council that it should require Israel to report within 6 months on investigations and prosecutions it is carrying out that comply with international standards with regard to the violations referred to in this report and any others that may come to its attention that may emerge. We recommend further that the Security Council should set up a body of independent experts, a committee, to report to it on the progress of the Israeli investigations and prosecutions. We also suggest that the committee of experts should be requested by the Security Council to report also on the prosecutions and investigations undertaken by the relevant Gaza authorities with regard to crimes committed by Palestinian armed groups. We recommend that in both cases, if within the 6-month period there are no good faith investigations conforming to international standards either by Israel or by the Gaza authorities, that the Security Council should refer either or both situations, as the case may be, to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. We were concerned at the use made by the Israel Defense Force of certain munitions, and especially white phosphorus, flechettes, and certain heavy metals such as tungsten. Their use is not banned under international law. That is clear. But we were concerned at the severe damage that was caused to people by some of those munitions, to property, particularly by white phosphorus, and again, it was luck more than design that it wasn't a great deal worse. And we've recommended that the General Assembly should promote an urgent discussion on the future use of those munitions generally in any wars anywhere in the world. As appears from the report, the manner in which those munitions were used in Gaza cause unacceptable and unnecessary human suffering, and also, I would stress, environmental damage. The extent of the environmental damage is not yet known, and it applies not only to environmental damage in Gaza, but also very probably in southern Israel. And we recommend that the United Nations should maintain a watch in the future to determine what damage may emerge, not only to the environment but also to some of the victims who were affected by these munitions, and to take steps that can be taken to remedy the situation. So those are the examples that I would like to give, some of the recommendations that we've made, and I hope it conveys to you at least some of the flavor of the report. As I mentioned earlier, it will be presented to the Human Rights Council in Geneva on September the 29th, and the missions, all 4 members of the mission, will be holding a press conference on that day. Thank you very much.